I just want to specify, I think the article you're mentioning is a 2017 essay, sort of an op-ed piece, really, from 3 years ago. And, in those op-ed pieces, I try to reflect a bit on this kind of some of these political currents, etc. But they operate on a slightly different register than my scholarship. There is some tangential relationship here and there, but it does operate on a different register. So I just want to clarify that.
Right.
As you said, I think Imran is an interesting character in that, on the one hand, he of course is a thoroughly modern figure, and in many ways a modernist figure also. And this whole way in which he's sort of resituating the idea of the community of Medina as a kind of model that is fully compatible with the values of modernity, but there is a certain kind of way in which he is tracing a sort of a genealogy of justice and a genealogy of catering to the dispossessed that does not pass through Europe, but that has a certain kind of an Islamic beginnings. It's of course a very sort of staple of a Muslim modernist perspective that perhaps is interesting in particular ways. It perhaps does not address a kind of ambiguities in the community of Medina model, in that as much as it did cater to sort of non-Muslim populations and the dispossessed, it did nonetheless have an imperial Muslim political theology underlying its logic, which you had to embrace the logic of Muslim superiority before you entered into an ecumenical space, etc. And as you said, there are other things to be critical about. Increasingly, I think a conception of justice that is perhaps not as enthusiastic about the injustices and the crimes of the military and the deep state that I think he used to be very articulate about maybe a decade ago, etc., in terms of enforced disappearances and basically the violence and crimes of the state that are quite well known. And of course, oftentimes a certain kind of notion of women's development that can have a kind of a patriarchal logic to it. Right. All these different things that one can be very critical about, certainly.
Absolutely.
But I think what the thing that, now coming to sort of the point that you're raising, I do think it is interesting that the kind of visceral reactions that he oftentimes espouses and generates have perhaps something to do with the fact that he may not fit that well a certain kind of a template of a Western educated secularist that one would desire him to fit into. I think there is this kind of the internal other, the kind of beardless internal other who is not as easily dismissible as the body of the bearded religious elite, right? So basically this whole idea of the way in which this word like mullah is oftentimes bandied around in Pakistani sort of circles, elite circles, etc., with very little knowledge of the ulama traditions and the complexities, their internal sort of debates and the kind of depth of this whole tradition, just taking some actors who fulfill liberal caricatures and making them the kind of representative of this whole tradition is essentially what I call in my book kind of madrasa-phobia, right? This idea that you just take a few figures and you really caricature them and look at the most dramatic examples of liberal caricatures, and then you attach that to that whole tradition, right? But perhaps Imran is not as easily dismissible as the body of the bearded religious elite. So there is that thing. But I think there are 2 points that I try to make in that essay, and then a couple of other essays I've written since then on this whole idea of, first of all, I think the whole question of Taliban Khan, what I see his argument, his long-running argument, is that one has to look at the emergence and the efflorescence, or rather the emergence and the metastasis of indigenous violence, militant violence, etc., as intimately connected to U.S. imperial power, and intimately connected to the history of British colonialism and more recently American neo-imperialism, that you cannot separate the two. In some ways there is a pacifist thrust to it that, military solutions cannot be durable, and there has to be some efforts to dialogue, etc. It seems like a very, it's not even a very profound point, it seems a very basic and logical point, but it's interesting the kind of reaction.
And it was, I mean, because I was here during this time, it was very frustrating when normally a progressive community that is anti-war generally, all of a sudden, even before kind of the major attacks, maybe the school attack on Peshawar and that type, even before that, more than willing to kind of endorse military operations that would target God knows who, collective punishment and all of
Yeah.
these things, that at that time they had very little concern of which Pathans would be affected,
Yes.
displaced, and so on. But all of a sudden, today and before the elections, the concern comes out. Whereas throughout that period, basically there was one person who was actually opposed to military operations, and that was our good friend Taliban Khan.
Right, and I think the larger point is that you cannot be anti-militarization and anti-military and still be pro-war. That does not happen, right? And I think another sort of clarification I should make, maybe I should have made it in that op-ed essay. Op-ed you get limited space. That when I use this kind of provocative category of liberal fundamentalist, I did not mean, of course, the entirety of the left or all critics of Imran. Of course, a very sophisticated critique that one can launch on precisely these questions, and many of those critiques I would agree with. But I meant I was referring to a very specific kind of breed, that is kind of pervades the kind of opinion pieces and newspapers, etc. The kind of sort of shallow commentaries in terms of looking at the world in terms of this binary of being divided between religious fanatics and the enlightened sort of secular moderates.
Liberals or fundos, yes.
Exactly.
It goes here.
So that was one point. And the second, I think, issue on which I think he has spoken in rather interestingly sophisticated ways is this whole issue of Islamophobia, and in the context of the Danish cartoons and more recently, France, etc. And I think the speech that he gave at the OIC last year and also the UN speech, I think he made a very interesting sort of argument, which had two parts as I read it. One was, why is the kind of pain which is associated with caricaturing the Prophet, peace be upon him, so untranslatable, so illegible to these Western audiences, which of course is a question that in much more sophisticated ways was explored by Professor Sabah Mahmood in her landmark article called Religious Reason and Secular Affect, an Incommensurable Divide. It's an incredible article. So that question also came up in those two speeches. And then the whole other point that he made was the question of why are these forms of violence associated with Islam or with Muslim militants always reduced to religion, as having religious motivations. Whereas, violence that is emanating from the Tamil Tigers, etc., other kinds of groups are not reduced to religion. So why is Islam pigeonholed in this way in which the violence emanating from Muslim subjects or Muslim actors is reduced to having quote unquote religious motivations? And it is then divorced from the political work that violence does. So that's how struggles in Kashmir and Palestine are delegitimated, that these are religious forms of violence, and hence, they are to be called militancy and terrorism, etc. So how is violence defined as being the opposite of politics? And so basically, what I saw was the implication of Imran's argument was to look at the intimacy of violence and politics, and this kind of a liberal, secular, Western assumption that when Muslims commit violence, it has nothing to do with politics, it's not political, it's religious, whereas when you maim and kill hundreds of children in the name of national security through drone strikes and then write memoirs about that with playlists, you have to celebrate it as some kind of hip African American president, and that's political. That's political, and that's not religious.